One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, welcome back. So we're in the second installment of a mini-series talking about detoxification. If you missed the introduction, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that because we're starting with some big picture concepts and probably one of the most fundamental ones, and this is a repeat from something I said in the last episode, is that when you think about toxins and detoxification or toxic burden or toxicity, however you want to phrase it, the reality is, and this is stated almost verbatim in the medical literature, is that exposure to toxins like mercury, other heavy metals, environmental chemicals is an inescapable fact of life. And it's not a matter of if you have a toxic load, but how bad is your toxic load? But perhaps more importantly, is your immune system responding to that? And that's going to be something we'll talk about a little bit more today. And I anticipate this podcast episode is going to be a little bit on the longer side as well, just quite simply because there's so much to talk about. One of the things that we ended with last time was looking at the general impact of toxins, and I think those items bear repeating, and that would simply be that regardless of what kind of a toxin you're looking at or talking about, they have a tendency to activate inflammation by driving an increased activity of what's called NF-kappa B. And if you did listen to the introductory lesson or some of the episodes that I did early on in this year, you'll recognize NF-kappa B as what we call a nuclear transcription factor. Basically, it's the on switch for driving inflammatory chemical production at the cellular level. But we also know that with an increased chemical load, that there tends to be a depletion of your major intracellular antioxidant glutathione. And that's a problem because glutathione is used in part of phase 2 detoxification. We'll spend some time giving you a little bit more detail about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, and how they all fit together and how they all work together. And this is one of the major problems, is that if you deplete your glutathione, not only do you lose phase 2 detox capacity and your ability to handle things like oxidative stress or free radical production, there is a crossover into another type of detoxification, which has more to do with not liver processing per se, but how we handle things that are called toxicants. And we'll define that again in just a moment, because glutathione acts as a natural chelator to bind and neutralize toxins so that they can be eliminated through stool or urine or sweat and so on. And there's a couple of other things, like we talked a little bit about how certain chemicals can be classed as endocrine disrupting chemicals, and they can mess up hormonal systems, particularly thyroid and estrogen. It can skew your immunotype. Environmental chemicals and toxic exposure and poor toxin handling is one of a handful of very common problems that can shift your immune system into some kind of an unfavorable profile where certain types of cells are, and their functions are increased, and certain are decreased, and that may not necessarily be a good thing. And there's any numbers, as of right now, we can identify about 13 different immunotypes with a couple of different subtypes, depending on which one we're talking about. And the final thing is how the chemical load can break your immune tolerance to the point where you actually start reacting immunologically. And that is what I called a qualitative aspect. And there's two sides to the coin when it comes to toxins. Number one is, how heavy of a toxin burden do you have? Because we all have it. And number two, more importantly, especially for people who are chronically inflamed, and especially if we know or suspect they have autoimmunity, is your immune system involved in terms of reacting to that? We talked about different ways to classify environmental chemicals or environmental compounds, and I defined for you terms like xenobiotic and toxicant. And a xenobiotic is something that does go through the liver. And a lot of chemicals that we look at when we do, say, an environmental chemical test, quantitative test, they do go through phase 1, phase 2, and then ultimately out through phase 3 and phase 4. And in these xenobiotics, or this concept is, I shouldn't say the concept, but the distinction between, say, a xenobiotic and what we call a toxicant, which is not handled by the liver, is not very well understood, certainly among healthcare consumers, and unfortunately also not very well understood with practitioners. If you think detox or say the word detox, pretty much everyone's going to think, well, I need to support my liver. And that means I get on Google and I search some, liver support herbs, and I come up with a list like silymarin or milk thistle and dandelion and, a handful of other things. And it's just not that simple. So a toxicant is something that's not handled by the liver, and that is handled predominantly by the chelating effect of glutathione, which then gets depleted by your chemical load. And so you can see how this can become a self-perpetuating problem. Now, a different way to categorize toxins would be to look at them from where they're sourced, whether those are exogenous toxins, things that originate from outside your body, and those would be things like heavy metals and chemicals or mycotoxins. And then there are these endogenous toxins that are produced by your own body, which are metabolic waste products or the intermediate, phase 1 intermediates of things come out of phase 2 that quite often are more toxic than whatever it was that we started with. And that I think that will serve as a pretty decent overview of where we were, what we started with in the introduction. And, I like to repeat things just because it's how we learn more easily. So let's talk just a little bit more about phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 as it relates to liver detoxification, the handling of these so-called xenobiotics, which then does include both exogenous as well as endogenous toxins. So things that you make in your own body and things that come into you from the outside. And one of the things that we want to talk about is just what is the nature of each of these different steps. And if you get online and you go to Google Images or something like that and just, type in liver detoxification, you'll come up with a number of graphics that will talk about phase 1 and phase 2. It'll talk about the enzymes that are involved in phase 1 and some of the amino acids and other compounds that are involved in phase 2. There's all kinds of nice little charts and graphs out there that can help you visualize some of the things that I'm talking about. You can also get all of this stuff. In fact, what I'm going through right now is kind of let's call it a watered down version of a self-learning course that I created that you can access on my website. Just go to the main page at drnoseworthy.com or drnoseworthy.com and look for the tab up top that says, I think it's called the programs. And I have a 3D detox self-learning program, which is pretty inexpensive, but it includes all of this information as well as a whole bunch more, including all of the graphics that I created to illustrate all of these things. So, check it out if that's of interest to you. And so let's talk about phase 1. Phase 1 is where the liver uses a family of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes to do the initial step of biotransformation. And in the very beginning of this little mini-series, we talked about how toxins are generally fat-soluble or fat-loving compounds. They are repelled by water, which means it's very difficult to get them to mix with things like urine or sweat or even the water content of the intestines to eliminate them through stool. And so the enzymes involved in phase 1 detoxification are there predominantly to start the transformation from a fat-soluble compound into a water-soluble compound, which allows it then to mix with urine, fat, urine, sweat, and stool. And like I said before, sometimes phase 1 doesn't work too well, and we end up with what we call enterohepatic recirculation, where toxins that normally go from phase 1 into phase 2 escape that system and continue to recirculate in an altered form that oftentimes makes them more toxic than the original compound. And this continues to drive systemic free radical production and oxidative stress and promotes systemic inflammation. Now, how is that going to manifest for any one person? Like I said in the last episode, it's going to be unique to them. So we might all have the same chemicals escaping the detox or biotransformation process in this step between phase 1 and phase 2, but we'll all have different symptom manifestations for the most part. And that's particularly if we're talking about the chronic setting. If you ever get online, let's say that you or someone helps you get a some kind of a chemical analysis to see what your toxic burden is, it's very tempting to go, okay, well, X chemical or heavy metal is elevated. Let me go online and search and find out what that does to me. But pretty much everything that's written about these things in terms of conditions they might promote or symptoms they might promote is all within the context of an acute exposure. Like I fell in a vat of chemicals yesterday. What's it likely to do to me over the next day, 2 days, week, or month? But most of the people that are, seeking help from me and other practitioners like me, they're in the chronic stage. And sometimes these chemicals are hanging out, I kid you not, decades after their initial exposure. In fact, I'm just remembering off the top of my head it was towards the end of last year, I was working with two women in 2 different locations, 2 different cases. And we did a urine analysis at an appropriate stage in their program. And both of them showed metabolites of a chemical called DDT, which I think I mentioned in the first episode. DDT was a chemical that was used in the 60s and very early 70s to control mosquito populations. And these women were both in their late 50s, early 60s. They were alive when people were spraying DDT in public places like beaches and parks, and families and kids are running around all over the place. And the interesting thing is that they showed these metabolites still in their system today, and this was in the end of 2021. And the the key concept here is that DDT has not been in production or use since about 1971, 1972. And so it's quite possible that some of the compounds that we can measure as toxins in your body could have been there for years, if not decades. Now, there's a general thought that if we pull a urine test on someone or a sample and run a toxin screen test on them to get a quantitative analysis, that generally, unless it's provoked in the sense of before we did the test, we use some kind of a chelating agent to pull things out of storage. If we don't do that, then most people think, well, this is about recent exposure because it's just in circulation. So it's probably what's coming into the body, but it hasn't been stored in things like body fat. And there is some truth to that. But the reality is on the other side of this is that your fat cells are constantly leaking out or leaching chemicals that they've been holding, in this case, sometimes for years or decades. And so your whole toxin environment is fairly dynamic. It's, if we did a test today and then did nothing to try to change that and did the same test maybe 6 months down the road, we might see different things because there's things constantly coming into your body, things that you've been storing for a long time are constantly being leached out of your fat cells for the most part. And so what we can measure in a urine test, whether it's provoked by a chelating agent or not, can change from week to week, year to year, month to month. And so all of these assessments are kind of snapshots of where we are in the moment. And it's, at least in my opinion, fairly important to get a handle on what your toxin load is, do something about it, and then check it periodically along the way until you feel comfortable that you've controlled your load and your immune system's not involved. Anyways, I got off on a little bit of a tangent, but it was certainly, hopefully you thought that was valuable. Certainly it's clinically relevant. All right, phase 1, it's all about taking fat-soluble toxins and converting them into water-soluble ones. Phase 2 is not an enzymatic process like phase 1 is. Phase 1 takes what comes out of phase 2 and adds something to it. It's a process called conjugation. And there are different things that your liver can add to these phase 1 intermediates. It can add a glutathione molecule. It can add a methyl group. It can add a sulfa group. It can use there is one enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, but it can use glucuronic acid to be proper. Beta-glucuronidase uncouples things that glucuronic acid has attached itself to eliminate, and so on. And, the interesting thing about phase 2 is a lot of it is based in amino acid sufficiency. So things like glutathione, which is a tripeptide amino acid blend that gives us our greatest antioxidant as well as chelating capacity. Then we have methyl groups or methyl donors, which is basically built around the amino acid methionine. And we also have glucuronic acid, which is not an amino acid or a protein-based compound, but it's actually derived from glucose, which means you have to have good blood sugar control and energy mechanics in order to have normal detoxification. And there's a handful of others. And again, you can find lists online. But the bottom line is this, is that when something comes out of the phase 1 process and hits phase 2, the purpose of phase 2 is add something to it to make it larger, to give it a higher molecular weight. And by doing that, it allows you to mix it with water. And that's where the liver, if you will, kind of finishes and completes the biotransformation process so that we can mix it in the water in the intestines to be incorporated in stool, or to be mixed with the water or the liquid component, if you will, of sweat or of urine. And without that process and without those two processes, that doesn't happen. And these toxins continue to circulate and circulate and circulate. Some will get deposited in fatty tissue. Some will leak out of fatty tissue and circulate and circulate and circulate. And this is why we have people who will always have chronic toxin loads, not only because it's the world we live in, but because once they get into our body, they have different ways to shut down our ability to excrete them. And so we're constantly having to deal with some kind of a toxic burden. Now, most docs will talk about phase 1, phase 2. Most things that you download on, say, Google Images that give you a graphic to look at, we'll talk about phase 1, phase 2. There's actually a phase 3 and a phase 4. Phase 3 is where these water-soluble metabolites are mixed with bile and then excreted into the gut to be incorporated into your stool. Now, anytime we say the word bile, people think, well, it's my gallbladder. And so the gallbladder, if it's there, sometimes people have it taken out. Sometimes it doesn't work too well. It doesn't squeeze hard enough to get enough bile into the gut to do its job. Nevertheless, bile is actually made by the liver. It's made by the liver, but it's concentrated in the gallbladder. The gallbladder does not produce bile. All it does is store it and concentrates it so that on demand, bile can be excreted into the small intestine in the upper portion to, first and foremost, emulsify the fat from your diet. But along the way, what ends up happening is while you are consuming food, hopefully with some kind of a fat content in it that causes your gallbladder to squeeze and put a whole bunch of bile into your small intestine, at the same time, your liver is exporting all of these phase 2 metabolites that have gone through phase 1, phase 2. They're ready to mix with water, and bile just happens to be a very large percent liquid. Hopefully that's obvious. And so what ends up happening is the liver does all the preparation, and the liver itself makes the bile that ends up getting squeezed into the small intestine. And in addition to that, the gallbladder, upon demand, when we consume fat-based meals or meals that have fat in it, will squeeze out its content of concentrated bile, increasing our ability to detoxify. And so you can think of it this way. On one hand, we're constantly detoxifying in the liver sense of things because we're constantly making bile and trickling that into the small intestine. And blood is constantly going through the liver where the phase 1 and phase 2 is doing its magic, and as long as the liver is making enough bile. But when we eat, when we consume food, our detox capacity actually increases simply because the fat content of what we eat squeezes the gallbladder, and we get a big bolus of bile that hits the small intestine and has the capacity to bind to toxins, including toxins that might be in the gut that have not yet been processed by the liver. And just to jump ahead a little bit, I think I mentioned in the first episode that the microbiome, the microbiota is probably a better way to say it. It's more technical, but basically all the good bacteria in your gut also have phase 1, phase 2 systems. And so it's not just your liver. It's not just about certainly the gallbladder. It's also including the gut environment, more specifically, the probiotic portion of your microbiome. And so that's phase 3. It's taking these water-soluble metabolites, mixing them with bile, and then excreting them into the gut. And then phase 4 is bowel movements. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're not going to the bathroom every day, you're not detoxifying. And it doesn't matter how efficient your phase 1, 2, and 3 is. If you're not moving your bowels daily, that stuff is going to go through enterohepatic recirculation, and you're going to tend to be more toxic than another person per se who is having daily bowel movements. Now that's an interesting thought. Now this is something I actually share this in to the astonishment of the doctors that have attended many of the seminars that I've taught where this topic comes up, because there are a lot of seminars that I've taught over the last 15 years or so in the functional medicine world that, detox is just not on the curriculum. It's just not part of what we're talking about. But anytime we have this conversation about the importance of phase 4, meaning bowel elimination, I tell this story, and we have 5 kids. They're all grown and out of the house now. We're in the grandparent stage, which is a wonderful stage of life. But my oldest, my only daughter, she is an RN, but she kind of had a start and stop to that career. When she was very young, she went into nursing school, decided it wasn't for her, went off and did some other things. She got her degree in nutrition, and then she went back to nursing school. And so she is an RN now with a degree in nutrition as well, which is quite helpful, of course. But when she came home that first semester when she was younger with her textbooks, I thought, whoa, hey, there's some nursing textbooks. Let me see what they're teaching nurses these days. And I randomly picked up one of her textbooks and started flipping through it. And as many textbooks do, it has these headings right at the top, just kind of give you a bird's eye view of whatever it is that section is talking about. And as I was flipping through, something caught my eye, and that something was the phrase perceived constipation. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to learn something new. I've never heard of this before. And so I scanned down through the paragraphs and found that section. And this nursing textbook, which was recently published, this is only probably about 6 years ago, somewhere around there. This nursing textbook defined perceived constipation as quote, the unrealistic expectation that you should move your bowels every day, end quote. And I sat back, I was just flabbergasted. And there's not been a single classroom of doctors and other health practitioners that I've shared that story with that haven't laughed and gasped at the same time, because it's just utterly ridiculous to think that it's okay to not go to the bathroom every single day. Why is it important? Well, for a whole host of reasons, but the relevant point here is that it is how you get rid of toxins for the most part. Yes, we do sweat them out. Some toxins come out through urine, but the vast majority of toxins that our body deals with that we want to get rid of go out through your bowels. They go out through stool. And again, if your phase 1 and 2 are working great, and if you're making bile and combining those things with the liquid portion to incorporate into your stool, but you don't eliminate that on a frequent basis, then you're going to be more toxic. And so one of my basic rules clinically is that I will never do a detox with anybody until they're having consistent, regular daily bowel movements. That's just like basic rule number 1. And I call it jokingly, yes, pun intended, I call it my bottoms up approach. You don't always start, or shouldn't always start, with increasing your liver's ability to drive phase 1 and phase 2, especially if you have bad gallbladder function, or maybe you don't have a gallbladder. If you're not making bile sufficiently, but most importantly, you have to be moving your bowels on a daily basis. And just to kind of give you a sense of how quickly and how often your body is kind of dealing with these toxins, trying to eliminate them, if we could take a toxin or a red blood cell, it doesn't really matter, something that's in your bloodstream, if we could tag it and follow it through the entire course of your circulatory system. Let's say that we hit the stopwatch when it comes out of the liver, because all your blood flows through your liver. And if we could tag one molecule of something and watch it and time it go out of the liver until it comes back into the liver again, it's only 3 minutes. To translate into that something different, to wrap your mind around, the entire volume of your blood gets filtered by this phase 1, phase 2 system in your liver every 3 minutes. Every 3 minutes, that's a lot. Now, obviously, the liver can't catch everything that's flowing through it at times. So, just to kind of make it simple, and again, to give you a mental image, let's say you have 100 molecules of some kind of a toxin in your body, and every 3 minutes, maybe your liver's only able to grab 4 of those. And so it's got to wait until the next go around, the next cycle of 3 minutes, to get the next 4. And so obviously, if you had only that amount to clear out, you'd eventually clear out all 100 molecules of toxin. But the problem is we're constantly being inundated with an intake of toxins through the food we eat, the air we breathe, and so on, which means that your detox capacity is happening all the time and it's constantly being challenged. And it's very easy to mess it up. Rule number one, and maybe we'll use this as the big takeaway, and we'll end this episode on this thought. If you're thinking about doing a detox, it's wonderful to have like a mental framework of what is phase one? How do I support that with natural compounds? What is phase two? How do I support that with natural compounds? What's the role of my liver and gallbladder in producing bile? How do I support that with natural compounds? But if your bowels are not moving every day, then do not do a detox. Just don't do it. Now, does that mean you just go out and use some Cascara Sagrada or, any other kind of herb that tends to move your bowels? Not necessarily, because if you are constipated and you're not moving your bowels on a routine basis, there's a reason for that. Is it your thyroid? Do you have a faulty brain-gut axis? Do you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth where the bacteria in your gut are methane producers that tend to produce constipation? So, are you infected? Is it the thyroid issue? Is it your brain? Is it any number of other things that are causing some kind of a sluggishness to your elimination process? And this is why, and I'll say it again, I know I said it in the first episode, and this is very important. I know that I have a lot of practitioners that listen to this podcast as well. If you do detox in your practice, please, practitioners, don't just automatically do a detox because it's how you get things moving with everyone. Don't just put somebody on herbal compounds that move their bowels without trying to find and fix the underlying cause. It doesn't really help you in the long run. This functional medicine approach to health and wellness, my take on that, what I call autonomous health, is about working with your body how it's designed and working with a set of principles and priorities that help you understand what's most important to do first. Because quite often, as we see year after year after year, people that we work with in functional medicine practices are, they're more complex. They're certainly more well-educated, as I talked about yesterday. But what it means is that you're not going to be successful, particularly with difficult cases, or if I'm talking to you as a healthcare consumer trying to help themselves, which I applaud. That is the whole point of autonomous health, is to help you understand how to take care of yourself and what is under your control. Don't just go, okay, I'm going to get healthy now. I have to do a detox first. Or I'm not going to the bathroom on a routine basis. Let me just take a stimulant that makes my bowels move without trying to figure out why you're constipated in the beginning. All right, it felt like I was on my soapbox just a little bit. So let's end it on that note, and we'll pick this up again on the next episode. Hey, thanks for being part of the Inflammation Nation. I really, truly appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.